So what's in your mind, and by the way, to our callers, 202-808-9925, give us a shout. And if you have questions for Congressman Khanna about, himself, what he thinks, what the news is, whatever it may be, it's, wide open topic-wise. Congressman, what are you looking at right now as a member of Congress? What in this coming week, what are the things that you expect to be happening? And I understand that we're once again a month away from a government shutdown. Do I have that right?
Well, it depends on what happens with the budget deal. I mean, and the Democrats, again, some of us are going to hold firm on getting a DREAM Act, making sure that we do something for the Dreamers, which we've just kicked down the road, and making sure that we're not having more cuts in whether it's funding for elderly with heating insurance, whether it's funding for Medicare, for nursing facilities. I mean, if you look at the budget and some of the things they're proposing, they're just outrageous. And so let's see what happens. But it very well may be another conflict.
Yeah. What other legislative issues are before you guys right now, or what are the things that the Republicans are preventing from coming to the floor? That
one of the things that's a little bit more foreign policy related, but Bernie Sanders and Lee have brought to the floor this Yemen resolution, which is supposed to get a vote actually tomorrow. And as your listeners probably know, because they follow a lot of our foreign policy, we have been aiding Saudi Arabia in refueling their planes and providing them assistance in basically killing Yemeni civilians. Almost a million Yemenis face cholera. Many are facing possible famine. And this is something that we've been doing. We finally, in the House, Mark Pocan and I got a resolution. The leadership didn't let it go through, but it would have called for us to stop any of the refueling of the Saudis. And we got a compromise resolution through that said that at least acknowledged that we were doing this without any authorization. Well, Bernie Sanders saw what we did in the House and got Mike Lee on it, and now we actually
who's a Republican, by the way, we should note.
A Republican, right? Yeah. And we actually Dick Durbin joined the resolution. So you have actually a chance that the United States Senate may pass this, which would be remarkable. And would finally end our aid to the Saudis in the Yemeni civil war. It's probably the largest humanitarian disaster in the world, given the suffering, and it's furthering this war with Iran. I mean, we're basically propping up Saudi Arabia in any possible way we can because we don't want Iran to continue to develop any ties in Yemen. And it's really absurd on its face. When you go back home, I was just back home this weekend, and you ask someone, well, should the United States be supporting the Saudi regime in a civil war in Yemen against the Houthis because of Iran's interest in Yemen? And should your tax dollars be going to that? I mean, I don't think there's any ordinary citizen in the country would say yes, and yet that's been our foreign policy.
Yeah, and you read through Madison's notes on the convention, on the Constitutional Convention of the summer and early fall of 1787, and repeatedly, I mean, over and over and over, particularly in the debates on Article 1, Section 8, and in the early discussions that led to the later formation of the Second Amendment, the two things that many of the founders were flipped out about. And these were people who had fought the Revolutionary War. They had been through it. The two things that they were flipped out about was that the United States might end up with a permanent standing army during times of peace. And they pointed out that repeatedly standing armies had been, Jefferson's phrase was, instruments of mischief. And what they were talking about was that, in Europe in the preceding couple hundred years, more often than not, when countries got overthrown, they got overthrown by their own armies. That military coups were a common thing, and so they didn't want to have standing armies during time of peace, or at least this large faction. And so they did three things. The first was they put into Article 1, Section 8 that Congress can fund roads forever. Congress can fund, the patent office forever, but they can only fund the Army and you can fund the Navy forever, but you can only fund the Army for 2 years. Period. Every 2 years, Congress has to sit down and decide whether we should even have an Army, or at least that was the founders' intent, and that's repeated over and over again in those papers as well as in the Federalist Papers. Number one. Number two. They said that this was the genesis of the Second Amendment, basically, that rather than having a standing army, every state should have a state militia that can be called up, and that debate informed the Second Amendment. And number three, they said that the power to wage war is exclusive to Congress. It's not in the branches. It's not in the executive branch. Now, since World War II, we've had the Korean conflict, the Vietnam police action. Now we've got Afghanistan, Iraq. None of these were declared wars. There was arguably congressional authorization for Afghanistan and Iraq, just like there was for Vietnam. But I would say that that's unconstitutional and illegal. Now we're involved with the Saudis in Yemen. We took down Gaddafi in Libya. We're involved in hot wars in, as best I can tell, 7 or 8 countries right now. And isn't it time to reconsider all this? And might you have, and if you agree with me on this, might you also have some colleagues among the Rand Paul libertarian faction of the Republican Party?
You're absolutely right, Tom. In fact, Rand Paul and I had written an op-ed together in the LA Times about 6 months ago saying we need a foreign policy of restraint. I mean, you cited the founders. We cited John Quincy Adams, who said, we can root for people around the world in terms of their aspirations for democracy, but we can't be going and sending our troops there because we often don't know who's on the side of liberty or not, and we would be perceived, according to Adams, as a dictatorial force, not as liberators. Just to add to your list of interventions that I don't think have been in our strategic interest, you could look at what we did in Ukraine, where Yanukovych basically wanted to have a tripatriot deal with the European Union and the Russians. We didn't agree to that. We insisted on NATO, Ukraine being part of NATO. I mean, that was George W. Bush's policy. And then when Yanukovych wanted to leave, and there was some aspect of trying to get him to leave and have an election, we basically supported a coup. So we have extended our intervention in ways that I don't think are in the strategic interest. And you have both progressives, people like Mark Pocan and Barbara Lee and Bernie Sanders on the one hand questioning that policy from a human rights orientation, but you also have people like Rand Paul and Walter Jones and Thomas Massey, Republicans and libertarians, saying this is not in the United States interest. We really need to rethink this neoconservative, neoliberal view of the use and projection of force. And I think you have people around this country saying, what have we achieved over the last 15 years from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria, Libya?